All right, so we come to the end of chapter 14, and we have finally arrived at the moment where the Union is going to enter its final crisis and it's going to fall apart. That did not seem likely after the success of the Compromise of 1850, but in fact that compromise had planted the seeds that would lead to the final crisis. The hero of the moment is Stephen A. Douglas. The Illinois senator who had crafted the compromise and was now seen as the great savior of the Union. And Douglas, who remember is in his early 40s, has only been in Congress for 7 years, 5 in the House, 2 in the Senate, very ambitious and talented fellow, expected to be rewarded for his role in the Compromise of 1850 with the Democratic nomination to the presidency for the election of 1852. The problem is that by the time that you get to the 1852 election, the compromise has already begun to get a little bit controversial, and particularly the fugitive slave law. Up until this moment, Northerners could always tell themselves that slavery was something that involved the South and not them. Of course, this was not especially true. Northerners and Southerners both supported and had created the Constitution. They both supported the federal government. Northerners were as racist, at least in the modern sense of the word, as Southerners were. They did not believe blacks could be equal to a white man. There were very few exceptions to that amongst the northern population. And of course, the North's economy benefited greatly from the cash crops of the South, which were grown by slave labor. So as always, the economic, the legal, the racial, the philosophical connection between North and South on slavery was there, but nonetheless, Northerners could reassure themselves that slavery was something that existed in the South. It's not something that existed in the North. Let Southerners live the way that they want to live and don't meddle in their affairs. But now there were federal marshals who were pursuing blacks supposed to be runaways, but not always the case, through the streets of northern cities, arresting them, using northern jails to hold them and keep them there, sometimes forcing local law enforcement to assist them, and then ultimately these people would be brought before a federal commission that would determine whether they were truly runaways or not, and be sent back into slavery. And having this happen in your own backyard was something that disturbed a lot of Northerners, and Northerners who, of course, are already more or less hostile to Southern political power and Southern economic power. It also inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe, the wife of a prominent New England minister, to write her famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which came out in 1852. It sold 300,000 copies in its first year of publication, which made it something of a phenomenon in the country. It was, of course, read mostly in the North. People in the South did not read it by and large because they saw it as a condemnation of slavery and a condemnation of their way of life. And it was that to a certain extent, although the characters in the book are interesting. The evil slaveholder, Simon Legree, is actually a New Englander who went south to become a plantation owner. There are kind Southern whites. There are blacks across the entire spectrum, some of them seemingly contented to be slaves, some of them not contented to be slaves. The book has, as one might expect, a very heavy Christian overtones to it. And the real impact of the book, I think, is not so much a condemnation of slavery as a labor institution as it was a condemnation of slavery as a human institution. And one of the most compelling things in the book is the breakup of slave families, as husbands and wives were sold away from each other, children were sold away from their parents. And this is absolutely something that didn't happen. It is something that some Southern slaveholders abhorred and would never do, but it was very prevalent, and this destruction of the family and the bonds of the family was an indictment that really struck at a lot of Northerners, because family was considered to be all important in the 19th century. And so I think that one of the things that Uncle Tom's Cabin did was to humanize the slave, by using literature, by using fiction. We see this sometimes happen in the modern era in movies, that a depiction on the big screen or on cable can give a human element to a complicated issue. Sometimes, in fact, usually that oversimplifies things. The narrative construct, paints things in black and white in a way that they typically aren't in the real world. But nonetheless, the impact is very real. And Harriet Beecher Stowe had managed to make slaves into human beings. And for the first time, there were a lot of Northerners who perceived them that way and could feel the pain of slavery. Now, that didn't change Northern racial attitudes at all, and it didn't necessarily change Northern political attitudes that slavery was the South's problem. The South could deal with it. They did not want to meddle. But for those who are already inclined to dislike slavery, the radical abolitionists, the free soil people, this kind of thing, of course, it simply intensified their feelings. And so all of that made the Compromise of 1850 a little bit too hot of a political potato for the Democratic Party to want to embrace in the election of 1852. After all, remember, it had lost the last election to the Whigs, and in two of the last three elections, the Whigs had prevailed, and so the Democrats want to play it safe, and that means they're going to deny Douglas the nomination. He's young, he's talented. They expect that sooner or later he will get it, but for the time being, they would like to go with somebody who's not going to excite passions. And that somebody was Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire, who was a party stalwart, somebody who hadn't taken any strong positions on the territory of slavery or popular sovereignty or the Mexican Cession or any of that kind of stuff. In other words, he was a safe candidate to go with. The Whigs sort of went back to their old and tried and true tactic of nominating a war hero to try and capture the presidency. This time it was General Winfield Scott, the conqueror of Mexico City, also one of the heroes of the War of 1812. But Scott did not have the allure of Zachary Taylor. The Whig Party is on sort of shaky ground after this Compromise of 1850 business, and in a party or in an election where there was no major difference between the parties. This whole slavery territory thing has been put aside, and so now we're back to talking about economic issues and tariffs and these sorts of things. There wasn't much of a reason for people to cast a ballot for the Whigs, and in an election that was not sectional in the least, the Democrats prevailed, getting 27 states compared to only 4 for the Whigs. And so that makes Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire the president. And he hopes to have a quiet presidency, and the country pretty much wished for him to have a quiet presidency. This was, of course, very disappointing to Stephen Douglas, but he had a much greater calamity befall him. In May of 1853, his wife, who he loved dearly, died, and he was devastated. Douglas was having a very hard time getting over it, and so friends suggested that he needed to get away. He needed to, clear his head and mend his wounded heart, and they suggested that a tour of Europe, which is something that wealthy, well-educated Americans were expected to do, that just might be the trick. So between May and October, Douglas traveled in Europe. He was gone for 6 months, and that was a long time given the fast pace of American politics during this period. And when he returned home, he had lost touch with the mood of the country, especially the North. This business of the fugitive slave law and Uncle Tom's Cabin being thrown into the mix, and the Underground Railroad still in operation, much to the chagrin of Southerners. But more importantly for Douglas, he understood that there was going to be a presidential election. in 1856, and he very much wanted to be the Democratic nominee for the presidency, and therefore he wanted to ensure that he would be the leading candidate for selection. And by the time you got to 1856, of course, the victory of the Compromise of 1850 will have been somewhat dated. We know it's already become somewhat tainted. And so Douglas wants to do something that will get people excited about his candidacy, put his name back up there in the forefront of the minds of his fellow citizens. And he also wants to get on with the business of the country. You know, one of the reasons that he had worked so hard for the Compromise of 1850 was to put this whole slavery business to bed and this territorial business to bed. Let's be done with it. Let's move on to bigger and better things. And for Douglas, who's the chairman of the Senate Committee on the Territories, the thing that seemed most important for America to do now was to build a transcontinental railroad. This was the great technological dream of the American people. The railroads had really come to the fore in the 1830s, the 1840s, and there was a giant boom in the building of railroads that was continuing on into the 1850s. Chicago, Illinois had become the center of a national railroad network. Chicago, of course, is Douglas's hometown. It's Illinois, very important in the railroad business. And Douglas wanted to see us build a transcontinental railroad. This is something that science fiction writers had been talking about, writing about for years. Yes, there was science fiction in the 19th century. And the idea of a transcontinental railroad not only was the kind of big thing that Americans like to do, were expected to do, this thought of spanning a continent with iron, the railroads going where man wanted them to instead of men having to follow the course of the rivers and using boats. That was an exciting thing. And it also kind of harkened back to the founding of the English colonies, right? Of all the European colonies. This attempt to find an all-water route to the Orient. Which turned out not to be there. The Western Hemisphere was in the way. But if you could build a railroad that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, then you wouldn't need the all-water route. You could ship goods across the Atlantic, then ship them across America by rail, and then ship them to the Orient by sea. And so everything that is old is new again. And so Douglas wants to build a railroad. The problem for Douglas is that building the railroad came with a certain amount of controversy. There had been lots of people dreaming about it, talking about it, and practically speaking, 3 routes had been proposed. 3 eastern cities of origin and 2 western cities that would be the terminus of the railroad on the Pacific coast. And one of those cities was Chicago. So we'll build a railroad from Chicago, which is really the heart of the Northern Railroad Network, and it will stretch across what is left of the Louisiana Purchase to the city of San Francisco. Then there was a proposal that the railroad should start in St. Louis on the west bank of the Mississippi and go to San Francisco, and then a third proposal, much favored by Southerners, that it would start in New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi and go across the Texas and the Southwest and terminate in Los Angeles. And of course, everybody had their favorite route, and that favorite route was often informed by their own special economic interest. It's not hard to guess what Douglas wanted. He wanted the railroad to start in Chicago, start in his hometown. But that means the railroad is going to have to cross the unorganized portion of Louisiana Purchase. So we remember that the Missouri Compromise in 1820 had drawn a line at 36 degrees 30 minutes north across Louisiana Purchase, and that line corresponds with the southern border of Missouri. And the Compromise says that south of that line you could have slavery, which means ultimately Arkansas and Oklahoma, but north of that line, with the exception of Missouri, slavery would be barred forever. But if you're building a railroad headed toward San Francisco, then you're going to have to pass through Louisiana Purchase territory west of Missouri. And that territory remained unorganized. That is, since 1820, it's never been carved up into territories. And the reason for that was pretty straightforward. Southerners had no interest in carving that territory up and putting it on the road to statehood, especially since those would inevitably be free states. So that was just a big blob of territory. There weren't a lot of whites out there. There were lots of Indians. It was a vast, open country. And if you were going to shove a railroad across it, you were going to have to organize it into territories because you would need law and order. You would need a method for mapping, plotting the land, selling land. The way that the railroads would make their money is to build the transcontinental railroad would be for the government to grant them a strip of land. Of course, they would only need a little bit of it to lay their rails and to build a station here and there. And the railroad would sell land alongside the track to people who wanted to live there. And of course, people wanted to live next to a railroad. That was where commerce and migration was going to happen. So it was prime real estate. And by selling that land, the railroad would raise the revenue to actually construct the line. So you have to have political and legal organization, which meant that you're going to have to make territories out of land that the South has no interest in seeing become territories and ultimately free states. And Douglas knew that if he was going to get this done, he would need the support of Southerners in the Senate. And they were going to drive a very hard bargain. They understood what building this railroad would mean for Douglas's career, and they also understood what building this railroad could mean for the South's eventual position of power or lack thereof in the national government. So when Douglas proposes a piece of legislation to create the territory of Nebraska, across which this railroad, or at least part of this railroad, would go, he has to get the buy-in of Southern senators. And so he meets with the Southern senators basically, and he says, hey, this is my idea. And they say, hey, Stephen, that's a lovely proposal. We love the idea of building a transcontinental railroad. But of course, we were hoping it would start in a southern city, say St. Louis or New Orleans, and you want it to start in your hometown. And it's certainly probable that getting this done is going to make you even more famous, and that might make you the next president. So it seems like there's a lot in there for you, and there's a lot in there for the North. What's in it for the South? Why should we surrender our ambitions of a New Orleans-based transcontinental railroad or a St. Louis-based transcontinental railroad, and let Chicago become the eastern origin of the line? And Douglas, who remember believes that this slavery business is not worth debating about, that slavery and cash crops are never going to go onto the Great Plains or the deserts of the Southwest, and he thinks he's put the slavery issue to bed. Douglas basically asked the Southerners, well, what do you want in exchange? What would make you willing to do this? And the senators, of course, have thought about that, and they have a ready answer, and what they want is the repeal of the 3630 line. They want to open what's left of Louisiana Purchase up to slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty. After all, they argue, in 1850, your own compromise, Mr. Douglas, allowed the territories of Utah and New Mexico to determine whether they would have slavery or not on the basis of popular sovereignty. We supported that. Seems fair, very democratic, very American. And if it's good enough for New Mexico and Utah, then why is it not good enough for what's left of Louisiana Purchase? Why is it not good enough for this proposed territory of Nebraska? And Douglas hears them out, and he does see the potential political pitfalls in this, but he also believes that, it's really not a valid issue. You can open this land up to slavery, Okay, but that doesn't mean slavery is really going to go there any more than slavery went into New Mexico or went into Utah. It didn't. Why? Because climate, soil, geography meant that you weren't going to grow cash crops there. And the same thing is going to happen in the Great Plains. You're not going to grow cash crops. The climate, soil, geography is all wrong. So saying, yes, slavery can go there, it doesn't mean slavery is going to go there. In fact, the practical realities of the world will mean that it probably doesn't. So is he really going to let that request stand in his way? And the answer is no. Now, he does try and finesse it. He goes through several versions of the bill that, sort of imply what the Southerners are wanting, but doesn't state it outright. But the Southern senators are determined that they're going to get precisely what they want, and ultimately they do. Ultimately, they do. And so Douglas, in the end, drafts something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And this is going to create the territories of Kansas and Nebraska through which this railroad is going to go. And the main portion of the Kansas-Nebraska Act that's going to be controversial is the repeal of the 3630 line. That had been part of the Missouri Compromise way back in 1820. So 3630 is going to get repealed. Douglas brings this before the Congress. And of course, it creates quite a debate. There is a lot of controversy around it, but ultimately Douglas, with the help of President Pierce, manages to get this through the Congress. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is voted into law. And so this is a great victory for Douglas. It was approved in the House 83 rather overwhelmingly. No real difficulties in the Senate either. And so 2 new territories are created. And Douglas has taken a long step toward building the Transcontinental Railroad, which he hopes is going to catapult him into the presidency. The backlash to this, though, was immediate. Northerners were outraged. There were a lot of very unhappy Northern Democrats. The Whigs, of course, were appalled by this. Northern Whigs were appalled by it, I should say. The old Liberty Party and Free Soil Party people were outraged by it. What Kansas-Nebraska did was to basically destroy people's faith in compromise, because the Missouri Compromise back in 1820, so 34 years earlier, had said that slavery would be barred north of 3630 in the Louisiana Purchase forever. Forever. That's not an ambiguous phrase, is it? Forever. Never will slavery go here. And now, 34 years later, that edict has been overturned. So if you ever need a definition for what forever means, here you go. Forever is 34 years. And so what good are compromises? If in a few decades, for political convenience, they're going to be thrown away, can we rely on compromises? Are we really solving anything? And as a consequence, therefore, of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a row of political dominoes began to fall. And the first of them falls in the very year that Kansas-Nebraska Act becomes law, and that is that the North sweeps out of office the congressman who had voted for it. So in the election, the midterm election of 1854, most of the northern congressmen who had voted in favor of Kansas-Nebraska are replaced. And some of them, many of them by Democrats, but there's also a new political party that is born, courtesy of Kansas-Nebraska, and that is the Republican Party. And yes, we finally get to the Republican Party that exists to this day. This is finally the birth of it. The Whig Party split apart between northern and southern factions, so Kansas-Nebraska Act kills the Whigs, it divides the Democrats into northern and southern factions, and it gives rise to the Republican Party, which is born in Michigan, in Wisconsin. The Republican Party is made up of unhappy northern Democrats. It's made up of old radical abolitionists from the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party. It's made up of disgruntled northern Whigs, and it is dedicated to restoring the Missouri Compromise, to putting the 36-30 line back in place. There were elements of the Republicans who were truly radical abolitionists who wanted to destroy slavery completely. William Seward, for example, Thurlow Weed, they were all part of this new Republican Party. But there were also moderates, people like an impressive young Illinois legislator who had served a single term in the U.S. Congress during the Mexican War, Abraham Lincoln, who was more of a moderate. He recognized that slavery was constitutional and felt that it couldn't be touched in the states where it already existed, but he also believed that it could be contained, that it was within the purview of the federal government to stop the spread of slavery into the territories, and that it ought to, that slavery ought to be put on the road to ultimate extinction. And so the Republicans are kind of a little bit of a mix, but they managed to elect 108 members of the House of Representatives in the election of 1854, which makes them by far the biggest voting contingent in the House at that time. Republicans stood for other things. They believed in restoring the protective tariff. They wanted to build the Transcontinental Railroad. They wanted to open the West up to homesteading, to settlement by farmers, and so free soil, free labor, that was kind of their motto, and they are going to be around to fight in the election of 1856. So the election of 1856 is around the corner, but between now and then you begin to get trouble in Kansas, because Kansas was going to be the first territory to get populated after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Northerners and Southerners were both determined to turn Kansas to their side. So Southerners rushed in, many of them from slave state Missouri, to ensure that Kansas became a slave state, and Northerners moved in determined to make sure that Kansas became a free state. And very quickly, the political differences, got intense. You had contested elections for territorial legislatures as free soil and pro-slavery elements duked it out with each other, and ultimately this is going to lead toward violence. As the election of 1876, or of 1856 rather, nears, pro-slavery and free soil people begin to raid each other's towns, raid each other's settlements. They begin to kill each other, and this ultimately gets way out of hand, and you have what is called Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, that's what the press called it, as Americans for the first time started killing each other over the question of slavery in the territories and the political questions wrapped up in it. There were atrocities committed by both sides, but one of the most infamous characters to come out of Bleeding Kansas was a fellow named John Brown, who came from back east. He was an Old Testament religious zealot who believed that slavery was one of the greatest evils known to man, that God had predestined Brown to help destroy slavery, and he and his sons went to Kansas, and with other followers they retaliated against pro-slavery attacks on Lawrence, Kansas, by staging a raid along Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas. That was where there were a bunch of pro-slavery families settled, and one night Brown and his cohorts went to 5 pro-slavery cabins, drug the adult males out of their homes and killed them by cutting off their heads. This was quite a sensation. Brown did other things like help slaves escape from Missouri, which made him a hero to Northern radical abolitionists. Of course, all of this made him a villain to Southerners. President Pierce ultimately had to send in the Army. Pierce's Secretary of War was Mississippian Jefferson Davis, who had helped to craft the compromise, or helped to get the Compromise of 1850 through the Congress. And he was very vigorous in getting U.S. troops in there to sort of separate the two sides and try and tamp all of this down, which was ultimately successfully done after a fashion, although bloodshed would never go completely away, and it would naturally flare up with great heat once the Civil War breaks out. But by the time that you got to the election of 1856, the things were at least beginning to be gripped. But that means that all of this stuff has once again come to a head. So we have the election of 1856. Pierce, who was never meant to be a two-term president anyway, and is going to leave the stage. He's not going to get renominated by the Democrats. They're still looking, though, for a candidate who is not controversial, somebody who might calm the troubled waters, and they decide on James Buchanan, a former Secretary of State, who's going to be the Democratic standard bearer. Notice that Douglas is not the candidate. The Democrats now believe that Douglas is even more radioactive than he had been before. And so it's going to be Buchanan. He's going to support the idea of popular sovereignty in these territories, even though popular sovereignty and the ambiguities in it have led to bloodshed. The Republicans are going to run their first candidate. So the party is brand new. It's born in 1854. It's only 2 years old. And they nominate John C. Fremont, who was one of the heroes of California's rebellion against Mexico during the Mexican-American War. He was also a famous explorer, nicknamed the Pathfinder for finding routes to the Rocky Mountains into California and the Pacific Northwest. Fremont was also very publicly anti-slavery. And he called for congressional action to prohibit slavery in all American territories. So he leaned toward the radical side of the Republican Party. That was probably his undoing, but nonetheless, this is a very close election in 1856. The country has divided now between North and South, and so Southerners all vote Democratic. You have a lot of Northerners who are now going to ally themselves with this new Republican Party. And so it's a very tight election. Buchanan manages to prevail, but it's very close. Very close victories for him in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Indiana and Illinois put him over the line. But it's clear that the country is sundering apart now. This is North versus South. When Buchanan is inaugurated on March 4th of 1857, he is inheriting a sea of trouble. And that becomes even more problematic for him on March 6th. So just 2 days after he's inaugurated, the Supreme Court hands down its ruling in the Dred Scott case. The Dred Scott case. So Dred Scott was a slave who had for a time been owned by a major in the U.S. Army. He was a doctor, and the major had many years before been assigned to the northwestern territory around the Great Lakes, and he'd taken Scott there and kept them there for several years until duty sent him someplace else. After that, Scott had been sold to a family which was actually anti-slavery, who wanted to free him, but they he saw in Scott's history a chance to try and strike a bigger blow against the institution of slavery. And so Dred Scott had sued for his freedom from his master on the basis that as a slave he had been taken into a free state, and since he had been taken into a free state where slavery was not allowed, he should have been free and should be free. Of course, this was always one of those ambiguities in the Constitution. You had free states, you had slave states, but slavery is constitutional. Slaves are legally recognized property. Can someone really be dispossessed of their property without due process of law by simply carrying it across a state line? That question had never been answered. Everybody had been willing to look the other way, but now it's been dropped in the lap of the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court did was basically to say that we're not going to hear this case. The Chief Justice, Robert Taney of Baltimore, Maryland, who actually had anti-slavery leanings, saw here an opportunity maybe to put this whole question to bed. And so what the Supreme Court basically says is we can't hear this case because it's improperly before us, that Scott is a slave, and as a slave he has no rights, and therefore he can sue no one. So this case should have never gotten to the Supreme Court. But having said that, Taney now goes on to give an explanation that is not necessary. He goes further than, he says, not only is this case improperly before us because Scott is a slave and therefore cannot sue, we should recognize that no black man is a citizen of the United States. And he gives a long history as to why this is so, and lots of examples that blacks are not citizens. As citizens, they can not only not sue, they have no rights that, as Taney puts it, that a white man is bound to respect. Blacks are slaves, slaves are property, and property can be taken anywhere within the domain of the Union. And if Taney thought that somehow this was going to solve the issue, he's wrong. Whatever the legal merits or the demerits of his ruling, which in fact wasn't a ruling, Taney has injected new fuel into the tension between North and South, because what he's basically suggesting is there can really be no such thing as a free state. Because if a slaveholder can take his constitutionally protected, legally held property of slaves anywhere in the Union, then he can take them into free states, and he can keep them in free states, and he can live in those free states with his slaves forever if he wants to. He can buy and sell slaves in those free states. And if that is the case, what's to keep slaveholders from flooding northern states with their slaves? If slaveholders can bring their slaves into free states and own them there and work them there and keep them there, buy and sell them there, then do you really have free states? And so this leads to the same kind of angst that Northerners had about the fugitive slave law, because it suggests that there really isn't a division between North and South. It suggests that what Southerners really want to do is get rid of the idea of slave states. And Northerners, of course, who are already resentful of Southern economic power, resentful of the plantation aristocracy in the South, see a plot by them to turn the whole country into slave territory. Now this is the potential of slavery coming in to our backyard, and Northerners did not like it. And so this fuels the tension even more. And so things are heating up. People are getting angry, and they're writing and saying angry things. And it's simply going to get worse as you have the struggle in Kansas continue between pro-slavery and anti-slavery. It's not been completely tamped down. And then you inject the midterm elections into it. In 1858, where you're going to have a chance to elect all the members of the House of Representatives and the third of the Senate. And one of the Senate seats that was up for election was from Illinois. Remember, state legislatures elect senators in this period of history all throughout the 19th century. That's not going to change until the dawn of the 20th century. And Stephen Douglas is a senator from Illinois, and he is his seat is one that is up for election. And if Douglas wants to fulfill his presidential ambitions, which he does by becoming the Democratic nominee in 1860, he cannot afford to lose this Senate seat. He needs to win it. If he can't win an election back to the Senate from his home state, what reasonable expectation of winning a national election could he have? Douglas, however, runs into unexpected opposition from Abraham Lincoln, who has ambitions to take that Senate seat from Douglas. Lincoln is one of the founders, if you will, of this new Republican Party, and so he basically challenges Douglas to debate. And Douglas, of course, tries to ignore him. Who is this young upstart? Lincoln actually pretty much the same age as Douglas, but young in a political sense. And the established senator doesn't want to give his opponent any oxygen. So Lincoln just starts following him around. And Douglas has got a big crowd, and he's going to give a speech, and Lincoln waits on the edge of the crowd until Douglas finishes his speech. And then Lincoln steps up and says, well, could I say a few words? And so he's basically stealing Douglas's crowds. And to deal with this, Douglas finally agrees to a series of debates, and these are the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Ultimately, there will be 7 of them, and they're not debates in the traditional sense. There's no moderator. There are no questions that are being asked. Lincoln or Douglas would go first, get up, they would speak, and these speeches were often very long, an hour or more, and then when they were done, their opponent would get up and get his turn. They all alternated who went first in all of these encounters, and in these speeches, Douglas tried to paint Lincoln as a radical abolitionist and somebody who believed in the equality of Negroes with whites. And he forced Lincoln to counter that by saying that he recognized that slavery was constitutional and could not be touched in the states where it was. He did not believe that whites and blacks were equal. Lincoln says, I don't believe in making blacks jurors, and I don't believe in making them voters, and I don't believe in letting them serve in office or any of these kinds of things. But I do believe that blacks have the right of self-government, that this idea of self-government that Thomas Jefferson talks about in the Declaration of Independence is not only self-government for people writ large, but for individuals. Every man has the right to govern his own body and his own future, to eat with the bread that he makes with his own hands, so to speak. So Lincoln embraces this idea that slaves are people. And then Lincoln tries to turn the tables on Douglas and basically says, look, what you did was you opened the door to slavery in the Louisiana Purchase. How is that not selling out the whole idea of free states? And he forces Douglas to admit that, look, I gave the South something that's worthless. I gave them the right to establish slavery in a place where slavery is never going to go, because climate, soil, and geography are all wrong for it. And so in exchange for getting the territories and the chance to build the railroad, they basically got nothing. It's a pig in a poke. And that worked. That prevailed. Douglas is going to win the Senate seat over Lincoln, but at the cost of doing 2 things. First off, making Lincoln even more famous, because he'd gone toe-to-toe with Douglas. He'd said the kinds of things Republicans wanted to hear, and now he is notable. He has got a national name. He's up and coming in the Republican Party. Still perceived to be a second-tier kind of personality in the Republican Party compared to people like Seward, for example, but nonetheless somebody to pay attention to. Douglas, in winning the Senate seat, basically destroys his viability as a presidential presidential candidate because the South, hearing Douglas in essence say, "Ha ha, look what I pulled off on them. I fooled them. They think they got something that was meaningful, and in fact they didn't." The South now believes that Douglas had lied to them. He had double-crossed them, and so they are done with him. And this is going to prove to be very bad for Douglas's political ambitions. And so in the election of 1858, the Republicans, managed to hold their own. The political calculus doesn't change a whole lot. But the year after that, an event takes place in Virginia, what is now West Virginia, at a place called Harpers Ferry that's really going to shake everything up. And this is where our friend John Brown from Kansas comes back in. He had fled Kansas with a price on his head. He'd gone back to New England, where he lived quite openly. People knew he was there, and law enforcement authorities did nothing. And what Brown did was get a hold of very prominent, very rich, radical abolitionists in the New England states, particularly in Massachusetts, and he told them that God had given him a mission to destroy slavery. And in that regard, they were on the same page. They wanted to get rid of slavery, but these very rich, well-connected men were not willing to do anything more than talk and to write about it. They would condemn, but they would risk nothing. They wouldn't get out of their comfort zone to do anything more than denounce slavery. And Brown has made it clear that he is willing to do a great deal more than that he is a man of action. And so basically he tells them, fund me, give me money, and I will strike a blow, a mortal blow, against the institution of slavery. Don't ask me what I'm going to do. And that was easy. They didn't want to know what he was going to do. They were willing to give him the money in belief that here was a man who would act, but they wanted plausible deniability. And what Brown did was to concoct a half crazy scheme to attack the United States arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, today West Virginia, where the Potomac and the Shenandoah rivers flow together. The water power provided by the confluence of the two rivers had made it a natural place to establish industry. George Washington, as president, had actually picked the site. And so there was a pretty extensive factory there where the U.S. government made weapons, made muskets and repaired muskets, and the weapons stored there and the ammunition stored there made it valuable to John Brown. And so on October 16th of 1859, in the company of 22 men, 5 of whom were free blacks and 3 of whom were his own sons, John Brown swept down on Harper's Ferry. He took a bunch of hostages. He seized the arsenal, and his intention was to use the weapons that he had captured and the ammunition he captured to arm slaves and start a slave republic, not necessarily a slave insurrection in the traditional sense that the armed slaves are going to sweep through the South and going to kill or run off all the white people. His scheme, which was really half-baked after seizing the arsenal, was to withdraw into the Blue Ridge Mountains, to let the slaves run away from their masters, come to him. He would arm them. They would create a free slave republic in the mountains, and the ripples of this would eventually somehow undermine the entire institution of slavery. Well, it didn't work. The townspeople got their guns. They surrounded Brown. Their local militias pinned him down. Brown, of course, had disrupted traffic on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that went through Harpers Ferry, and the railroad president telegraphed President Buchanan about what was happening, and President Buchanan acted very swiftly, and he called on Robert E. Lee, who was lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He had been most recently serving as second command of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry in Central Texas fighting the Comanche, but he was back home dealing with the estate of his father-in-law, who had died and left him and his wife Mary the Arlington Plantation on the banks of the Potomac, where the National Cemetery is today. And so Lee was close at hand. He was called in, told to take command of 2 companies of Marines from the Washington Navy Yard and a battery of light artillery, get to Harpers Ferry by rail and deal with Brown. And so Lee, accompanied by a young lieutenant by the name of Jeb Stuart, who's going to become a famous lieutenant of Lee's during the Civil War, went to Harpers Ferry. Brown and his men were, of course, already pinned down, so Lee and his Marines took over from the civilian militia. They gave Brown a chance to surrender. He refused, and at that point, Lee ordered an attack. It was over very quickly, and Brown was wounded and captured. In the fighting, 5 of the townspeople and 2 of the Marines were killed, along with 10 of Brown's men. The rest were arrested. They were very quickly put on trial for inciting servile insurrection, so within 2 weeks they were put on trial. And here John Brown did himself a favor. He was kind of a fanatic, but he acted in the court like a very dispassionate, reasonable man. He was polite. He didn't interrupt, but he was stern in what he said. He said, I have no hatred toward Virginians or Southerners, but I am compelled by my faith and by God to point out that you are perpetuating one of the greatest evils known to man, and anybody who does anything to destroy that evil is justified in doing so. But I mean this with no offense. Brown came across in the newspapers like a rational, sane person who was logical and was doing something that was logical, and even Southerners begrudgingly admired his performance. None of that changed the reality. He was guilty, and he admitted to being guilty. He had attacked and seized federal property. He had killed people. The first person who died in his raid, ironically, was the free black station master at the railroad in Harpers Ferry who had gotten in his way. So Brown was convicted, and on December 2nd of 1859, he was hung. And as he was going to the scaffold, he had handed a note to one of the men who had run the jail where he was kept. And the note said that basically I, John Brown, had believed for a long time that the sins of this guilty land might be washed away without bloodshed. And now I have come to realize that that's not going to be the case, that it is only blood, and a great deal of blood, that is going to purge the sin of slavery from the United States. And of course, those words were going to turn out to be prophetic. At the time, John Brown's hanging was viewed by most Americans, North and South, as justice done. The guy was crazy. What he had done was violent and illegal, and he got the fate that he deserved. Even Lincoln said that this is what somebody like Brown, today we would call a terrorist, has earned by his actions. But in the New England states, where the radical abolitionist element was strong, Brown was viewed as a martyred hero. The Southerners were actually afraid that there were plots afoot by New Englanders to come rescue him, to keep him from the hangman's noose, and so the cadets of the Virginia Military Institute had been called out to guard Brown's execution. Of course, nothing like that happened or was going to happen, but the fact that Southerners could read about Northerners, New Englanders, considering Brown to be a martyred hero, someone who was willing to act against the great evil of slavery, that church bells tolled in mourning when he was hung, and public buildings were draped in black out of respect and mourning for what Brown did, sent a shudder of horror through the South. It played into the stereotype that the pro-slavery radicals in the Southern politics had been painting of Northerners as so hateful of the South, so hateful of Southern economics and political power, that they would be willing to do anything to bring it down, and that meant race war. Then they would be willing to help start race war. And so Southerners now began to believe that the North was willing to turn their slaves against them, that the North, the people of the North, had become implacable enemies. Now, to be sure, this can be overplayed. Most people, North and South, wanted to find a peaceful solution to all of this. They wanted to go on with their lives. They wanted to hold the country together. They loved the Union. They shared a common history, a common language, and more often than not, a common religion. But the political side of this was getting out of hand, and the passions and the emotions that had been stirred over the last several decades were felt very deeply, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for people to control events. Events were now beginning to control people instead. And all of this, of course, is taking place as the election of 1860 looms. And a Democratic Party divided into northern and southern wings, into pro and anti-Stephen Douglas factions, is going to go up against a Republican Party that is united in its efforts to try to restore the Missouri Compromise and stop the spread of slavery. And that sets up the climactic election of Abraham Lincoln, which is going to turn out to be the trigger to finally bring us to secession. And secession is going to lead very quickly to civil war. So that brings us to almost the very end of chapter 14. In the next lectures, we will elect Lincoln, and we will start and fight the war between the states. So now a couple of questions for you. What was the name of the law that Stephen Douglas got passed that creates the Republican Party and divides the Whigs? What's the name of the law Stephen Douglas got passed that creates the Republican Party and divides the Whig Party? Who was the president of the United States from New Hampshire who was forced to deal with the problem of bleeding Kansas? Who was the president of the United States from New Hampshire who was forced to deal with the problem of bleeding Kansas? John Brown staged his October 1859 raid on the U.S. Arsenal in Watt Town in Virginia. John Brown staged his October 1859 raid on the United States Arsenal against Watt Town in Virginia. And what was the name of the U.S. Army officer who led Marines to put down John Brown's attempt to incite a servile insurrection? And then finally, what was the name of the book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe that helped to humanize slaves in the eyes of Northerners? What was the name of the book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe that it would help to humanize slaves in the eyes of Northern readers? So answer those questions, email them in to me, and when we get together virtually next time, we will elect Lincoln and start the Civil War.